Um, so I'd like to thank everyone for joining and welcome you to this panel session this morning. So it's the first of our panel sessions so far this year. And today I've got 4 panelists joining me, and we're going to talk about the top bank fraud cases and also a little bit about some trends that we think you should be looking out for in 2021. So, for the webinar, all of your phones have been muted. Hopefully you can all hear, but if not, there's an option to connect, so you can call in using your computer. It typically offers the best experience, the best sound quality. So if you pick that option at the bottom of the screen, the computer will call you back, WebEx will call you back at the number that you choose. Obviously, hopefully you can read it rather than hear it, because if you're connected, you can hear me anyway. You can submit questions throughout the webinar, so if anything sparks your interest and you'd like to raise a question relating to it, or even just a question out of the blue, feel free to submit those. Minay and Isabel will hopefully be reading those and maybe feeding a few of those through to me. And we're going to leave those questions until the end of the discussion. And if you want to, if we pick your question, I'm quite happy to unmute you if you'd like to talk that question rather than just us read it. And the webinar is being recorded, and we'll send this webinar recording a link to it after the event, along with all of these slides, although the slides are not really that meaningful, to be honest. And also, we'll be sending you a white paper on the latest fraud cases as part of that package that we're sending out following the webinar. You can put us all, when I stop sharing these slides, you can put us all into a grid view so that you can see all of the panelists. And there's an option as well, I believe my colleague tells me, to hide those that are grayed out. So there's a couple of panelists that are effectively our hosting team without the camera switched on, and I believe that you can switch those off. I will have to try that. And before we get started, let me firstly introduce our panelists today, and I'll give each of them the opportunity to introduce themselves a bit more meaningfully. So I have Ronan Guckian joining me from KBC in Ireland. Ronan's a fraud investigator there within their financial crime unit. Thanks for joining us today, and happy St. Patrick's Day to you, Ronan. We've got Romano Ramanti, who works at Zurich Cantonal Bank, where he is responsible for e-banking operations there, but also he is, interestingly, an ethical hacker, so hopefully it will be some interesting discussions there. Thirdly, we have Steve Young, who works as Group Compliance, Fraud and Investigations for Bank Lombard Odier in Geneva. And then finally, thankfully, we have Philippe Fleury, who is joining us from KPMG in Geneva, where he's Head of Regulatory and Compliance as well as Forensic. And it will be interesting to hear him talking about perhaps some of his forensic activities if he's able to. So without further ado, let me stop sharing my screen. And let me perhaps pass over firstly to Ronan to introduce himself firstly and share anything that he wished to start with.
Okay, good morning, everyone. As Roy was saying, I'm an investigator with the Financial Crime Unit in KPC, and my background is as a criminal defense lawyer, specializing in fraud. So it's certainly been an exciting year last year and this year, so I'm looking forward to going through some of those cases.
Thank you very much. Romano next, perhaps.
Yes, thank you, Roy. So I want to also welcome all participants to this webinar. I hope it will be a very interesting panel session. So I'm Romano Ramanti. I work at the Zurich Cantonal Bank. I have two parts. A part of my job is, on the one hand, the analysis of the current threat landscape, and based on this information, we try to improve our actual filters in order to prevent fraud. And on the other hand, I try to find vulnerabilities or loopholes in our e-channels, and I try to do this from an attacker's perspective. So, like one from outside would do it, and hope to find loopholes in order that we can close them before our customer loses some money. Yeah, that's all for me.
Excellent, thank you very much. Steve, could I ask you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and may I add a happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone attending, being Irish like Ronan. My background is law enforcement. I did 20 years law enforcement, then I jumped into corporate world. I've been 20 years in corporate world in various banks in a fraud and investigations role, and I'm now luckily to be living and working in Geneva as head of fraud and investigations for Bank Lombard Odier.
Thank you very much. And then finally, lastly but not least, Philippe, if you could briefly introduce yourself as well.
It's a pleasure. Hello to everyone. I'm Philippe Fleury. I was educated as an attorney at law. I then joined the supervisory authority FINMA in Switzerland. And finally, 13 years ago, I joined the KPMG, where I had the forensic practice for financial services. So we were conducting investigations. And because this is frustrating, because we always come too late, we try to help banks to prevent the risk of fraud. So I'll be happy to share some experiences that we have and the trends that we see on the market.
I mean, that'd be really interesting. Thank you very much for the introductions there. So diving right in. So the form of this is going to be an open panel discussion. Hopefully I'll be sitting in the background just spurring some good discussion, some lively discussion between my panelists. So to start with, let's talk a little bit about this last year. So it has been, as we've alluded to, it's been an unprecedented year. So we've lived through some strange times. Have you seen any impact in terms of, the impact of the pandemic and any associated events on fraud exposure within your organizations? So, have you seen anything that's been unexpected? Have you seen anything that surprised you? Have you faced any challenges? Perhaps I can ask Ronan in first instance to supply some thoughts on that.
Yeah, without a doubt, the pandemic has had a huge impact. I wouldn't say that we see a dramatic rise in fraud, but absolutely cases are increasing because what we see in the remote environment, as everyone knows, is that that attack vector has expanded considerably. And what we do see is very much on anything that is not present in remote fraud has increased without a doubt. So card not present fraud, application fraud definitely increased. And I think what the pandemic has done is meant that a lot of criminal organizations have now realigned their own strategies, just like the banks and corporates have their own strategies. That they've realigned their own strategies for remote fraud. And as the famous cartoon goes, no one knows who you are on the internet if you're a dog. No one knows you're a dog on the internet. So without a doubt, we've seen a dramatic rise. And similarly, the reliance on various platforms on the internet by customers has increased dramatically. So we're starting to see a lot more frauds originating from social media platforms in particular as the hook location to get victims. And that is increasing all the time. And I mean, frankly, no organization, including Facebook, seems to have capability to conduct meaningful surveillance on that. So the reality is, as Tony Blair said, education, because I'm still stunned by the number of victims I speak to, some of whom are customers, who fall for these scams. And the only other thing I'd add on that is with the remote environment, we're seeing that the quality of websites, text messages has stunningly increased. So it's no good telling people, oh, well, look for the spelling things. And that's none of that applies anymore, because a lot of these people are using, web tools and so on to produce fabulous looking stuff. I mean, I've seen, messages and websites. Some of them are nearly better than the retail product. So Big challenge.
And I see others nodding. So Romano was nodding there. Is there anything, I guess, interestingly, in terms of your sort of role, understanding what's going on in the darknet? Are you seeing any, any different or emerging attack vectors? Any different sort of threat patterns?
Oh, I don't think so. From what I saw in the darknet, it's not that there are different attack patterns, but we saw a really increase of discussions around COVID-19, and a lot of cyber criminals discuss how they can attack victims, how they can set up fake websites in order to attract these victims. And this is one of the biggest things that I personally identified on the darknet. From the other side, we saw also that they are reusing. So we had a big distribution of malware. That's just nothing new. So we had around 460% increased distribution of malware. But what we saw that they try to reuse existing features on systems. So they don't really necessarily rely on something strange, but they reuse existing features on the system that lead to attacks. And this is something that I really saw now in this COVID-19 phase, which was really heavy discussed on the darknet.
Right. And is that new threat actors or just existing threat actors becoming more specialized and working in cahoots with others with other similar specialities in other areas? Any view on that?
We have both. We have established a threat actor that works since long time, and what we saw also, we have new threat actor, if we can call them threat actor, but basically these are people that use this malware as a service. And so you don't need to really have a high level of knowledge, so you can just go there, use this malware as a service, you receive a malware which you can distribute. And most of them, it's really interesting, most of them are asking how they can distribute a malware, and they receive hints how they best can send spam mails or phishing mails, or they can set up a site that is COVID-19 related.
So the barriers to entry are unfortunately fairly low, aren't they? And Philippe, I guess in terms of your sort of role going in and doing forensic examination following incidents, is there anything that you're seeing that's unusual or new?
Yeah, maybe three aspects. I fully agree with Romano and Ronan. We have seen an increase in scams. What I can say is we don't have seen an increase in fraud. We have seen an increase in fraud attempts. And most of the banks were pretty successful in counter this fraud, but definitely the fraud attempts significantly rose with the crisis. Second point, certain types of fraud increased. Everything which was related with scams, with identity theft, with account takeovers and so forth, with cyber attack, with payment frauds has significantly increased. And other types of fraud, asset misappropriation, corruption, and so forth, have remained the same, pretty much at a high level. What is interesting to see in this context is that the average length of fraud and the value of fraud until they get discovered has remained appropriately the same, which is not a very good news for my co-panelists, because it seems that the countermeasures are not really working very well or not increasing in their efficiency. And the third trend that I see or that we see during this crisis is the internal fraud. Obviously, we have spoken a lot about external fraud, and this is a phenomenon to be noticed, but internal fraud did continue, and they're still the most significant one in the damage. Though we, while speaking, we should not forget the internal frauds, while the attention of the public and the banks is on the external ones.
Yeah, and are any of the panelists seeing evidence of kind of collusion between those external threat actors and, internal staff members making mistakes or misjudgments, let's say, and getting involved?
I think, Roy, it's very important to say that without a doubt, criminal organizations are looking at putting people in banks. There's no doubt. And if we look at the remote environment, now more than ever, it's so important that risk assessment is done correctly in relation to remote onboarding, not just for your customers, but for your staff. Who are you dealing with? Because a lot of the time, if we have as we do have everyone working from home, it becomes easier to spoof your identity as an employee, which is would be even more alarming. So really, risk assessment around what's changed in your control environment in terms of the COVID situation. Very important that that's done. And I'd advise it strongly. If you haven't looked at your HR function, absolutely look at it because of COVID.
Mm-hmm. I don't know what that says. I joined Net Guardians remotely in the last 6 weeks or so I'm not a fraudster. Steve, and I don't know whether this is an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So, there's been lots written in the press and lots discussed about pandemic relief programs and the threat opportunities and kind of, the opportunities for fraudsters that those present. I guess over the last sort of 6-9 months, have you seen any evidence in terms of a fall off in the kind of the threat against your institution or in general, while they kind of re-navigate and pick those easier rewards in those pandemic relief programs?
Yeah, thanks, Roy. So listen, I think my experience, and I had the benefit of speaking to some of my colleagues in the other private banks in Geneva, but also around the world. So our experience is really different from Romano and Ronan, and the reason is this. I mean, the basic premise is fraud doesn't disappear, it simply migrates. And what we've seen is with government relief schemes and furlough schemes having to be rolled out at pace very quickly, we didn't necessarily see the control environment that came with those relief schemes. Not a criticism. They had to be done quickly. Mm-hmm. So fraudsters, in my view, jumped into that. They saw the weaknesses. And I think as we emerge from the pandemic, we're going to see what the results of that are. Just speaking purely to the private bank sector, dare I say, I think the fraudsters moved across to our colleagues in retail, consumer, and corporate banking. I know their attack vectors went up. And I think private banking sector maybe benefit from that because we were either flat or down. So we're expecting it to come back as fraudsters move out of their sort of pandemic lower hanging fruit and come back to attacking high net worth customers in the private bank sector. So a slightly different experience from Ronan and Romano. Obviously, Philippe has got a much broader view, but if I just speak exclusively to private banking and asset management, we actually saw a reduction.
Interesting. And I guess kind of then projecting forward a little bit and looking out to this year and beyond. So, I guess we've seen a massive uptake in terms of digital, and I'm not really talking here specifically private banking here, Steve, but, in terms of, retail banking. So my father, for example, who'd never banked online before, had never done digital banking, was forced to do it. And, it took him a while to get used to it, but he did do. Are you seeing, any impact, any worries about that, or any fallout from that? I see Philippe nodding his head. Perhaps I'll go to him in first place.
Yeah, what we can see is that not only because of the pandemics, but because of the evolution of the banking world, mm-hmm. The opportunities get larger. The banking world is getting more and more digital. The clients expect more and more faster payment. The face-to-face interaction between bank and client tends to disappear. The clients want to take ownership of their account, and they just pass on orders and payment orders. So this opens up the opportunity of frauds. And if I go along with Steve, we see a shift from the fraud targets in these days and years. The banks used to be the main target of the frauds directly in the past, and now we see a trend towards the clients, and fraudsters attack their clients, try to steal their ID numbers, their personal coordinates and personal elements, so that they can directly interfere between the communication between bank and clients. And this is for us the biggest opportunity and the biggest threat. If Steve said that he experienced less fraud, probably fraud success of fraud, that means that banks are more protected, but the customer corner is less protected and not educated enough for the moment, and that opens up a big opportunity.
And it's interesting to hear you say that. So in terms of those attack vectors on bank customers, I guess Romano, this might be a question for you. Are you seeing kind of the convergence and of fraud and cyber threats, and that being effectively monetized?
Yes, there are sure a conversion, but I want just to add something to the thing that Philippe said before. What we saw now is that the cyber criminals are using more social engineering tactics, because social engineering is one of the most profitable attack vector that they have. So with less effort, they can earn really a lot of money, and that's what they are trying to doing. So we see also when we look back last year, also this year, we have an increase of investment scam. So customers are called by fraudsters, and they try to convince them to make an investment. And this is really very easy. They don't need to install some malware. This is just a phone call, just explaining something or a short history that they believe, and they try to convince them to make an investment. Or on the other hand side, we have this e-banking fraud in which they send a banking Trojan to the customer. And with all these social engineering tactics, they really have the possibility then to get the email, the contract number, the password, and also the OTP. This is one of the biggest changes that we saw in the past. Social engineering is raising from our bank's perspective. And they really gain a lot of money then with this.
And have you experienced similar, Ronan?
Yes, absolutely. So this movement, obviously, the PSD2 has had a massive impact, and the impact is a good one in that we have safer authentication methods. But of course, the answer is get the authentication method and do that through a low-cost, low-tech social engineering. So if you're good on the phone, you'll do well, and that's the reality, and that's why education is so important to customers. But also, banks need to ask themselves, how are we talking to our customers? How are we talking to them, and why are we talking to them? Because ultimately, if we have certainly spoofed bank calls, the question is, are we telling our customers enough to inform them? You can expect, these are the types of communications you can expect. So that's really important. And on the investment fraud point, there's a massive explosion in investment fraud. It's huge of what we know so far. So GameStop and Robinhood has really permeated into the day-to-day ether, and people are literally going onto Google and typing in things, and that's it's a massive opportunity for fraudsters, and we can see they're taking it. And the platforms that they are launching off these investment frauds are fabulous. You would think these are absolutely trading platforms, and they're not. So really important, and for our regulators, really important, I think, to keep an eye on that.
Interesting. And Steve, is there anything that you could add? Any similar sorts of experience? Anything different from your perspective and your bank's perspective?
Yeah, if I could just build on what Romano and Ronan said, and certainly Philippe will be able to identify with this. A key factor you need to build in, particularly on the social engineering, dare I say, is age. Because obviously, as you live your life, you generally, if it works for you, get wealthier as you get older. So what happens is we know that older people are much more susceptible to the social engineering. And certainly when I speak to colleagues, that's what they say. Younger people tend to be probably a little bit more savvy. They're much more tech savvy, and they're a little bit more wary. Older people, unfortunately, more trusting of people who call them up and say, I'm from the Geneva Tax Authority, or I'm from Microsoft, or wherever. And to be honest, when you talk about those 1, 2, 3-factor authentication processes, one-time passwords, the really good social engineers have got the customer, conducting a transaction for them. So the back engine of transaction monitoring and tools which detect behavior become really important to defeat those attacks.
Yeah, interesting, but also somewhat scary. And I guess in that context, so, and again, hopefully not an unfair question, let me ask the question, what keeps you guys awake at night? So talking and thinking a little bit about what you're seeing, what your concerns for, the upcoming months and years are. Is there anything that really, really concerns you? And I maybe will pass that through to, let's go to Romano in first place.
So I can say I can sleep well the night, but no, certainly we have some, I see changes or some threats that we are worried about. So when we look, we are entering a complete new era. We have cyber criminals that use actually AI in order to generate their own malware. That they can bypass all filters, and that's really one thing that we are facing now, that we have to really observe closely. And on the other hand side, we have also all these deep fakes that are really increasing, and that are also a problem for our customers and for the bank itself. We had a similar case in which we received a call that was spoofed from our CEO, and it was really a deep fake. And this is something that is really concerning when you look at all these future trends. And last but not least, we have also, we saw an increase of these sophisticated attacks. So all these cyber criminals, we have like 2 ranges of cyber criminals, and the one that are really on the high level, they use sophisticated attack that we never saw before. And I think that it will go in this direction, that we'll face new threats, new attack vectors, new I see cyber criminals that we have to face, and we have to find a solution in order to combat them. So we cannot combat them, but we have to track them really close.
And are you seeing the kind of the velocity of those attacks and, the way that innovative attacks are built and vulnerabilities chain together? Are you seeing that, is that speeding up, or any evidence of that?
From that, what I see, it is really speeding up, and I think it's maybe too fast for us, that we still try to combat the fraud from the 2019, and now we are facing a completely new era. And I think it's the speed that it takes is really high, and we need really to stay behind them, because otherwise we are lost.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. Who else would like to voice an opinion on that question about what keeps them awake? Anyone brave enough? Ronan?
Well, Bangladesh always keeps me awake at night. That is something that always worries me. And as we're saying, and as Romano is saying, as this time goes on, and we adopt more of this the remote situation, and that's going to be there for, we've no doubt. The balance is definitely going to tilt that way. There's no question that that's going to be the case. So we don't know yet from since the measures came in last year in March. I'm reading some of the case studies are very interesting that are coming out in relation to quote mistakes and other things that have happened. So I think it's really interesting in terms of where that's going to go from. Again, going back to the internal threat, because the real worry I always have is it's people in your organization who, as Philippe was saying, who can create the most damage. And if they are working with an outside party, and you could end up with a situation like Bangladesh with SWIFT, and that's the kind of thing that would really certainly concern me, because I don't think we have the full picture yet on how that's being managed. That whole risk in general by the industry in general, how that problem is being managed in terms of making sure that your staff are properly supervised and introduced to the bank.
Thank you very much. And is that something that you're also seeing talking with your clients, Philippe? Is there anything you can add to that?
Yes, with pleasure. I think banks are pretty good to fight against external fraud, against these scams, against IT fraud. We see the role of Romano. The role of Romano probably did not exist 10 years ago, and banks are facing this challenge. I see two areas where banks are still struggling. The first one is with the false positives. Banks have no monitoring tools like yours, Roy, Net Guardians, and others have implemented that, but still struggling with the false positive. So in terms of parameterization, risk benefits, costs, there is still to do. And the second is about internal fraud. As Ronan said, these internal fraud are frustrating because in most of the case, almost 100%, somebody knew within the organization, somebody had suspicions. Though the challenge of the bank is to get these voices to them, is to put in place mechanisms that can report these suspicions that would not probably impeach the fraud, but that would make the fraud much smaller, much quicker to detect and have more damage. So I see these two challenges in addition to what my colleague said.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess coming to Steve, not on this question, but a different question here. So I know as a former law enforcement officer, do you think the tools are in place? Do you think the mechanisms to combat these various threats, these escalating threats, are strong enough? Is there an understanding amongst law enforcement, regulatory agencies and the like of the severity of the threat? Is the response appropriate?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I think the tools are keeping up. Let's be fair, it's a never-ending race. So there's always going to be evolution on the fraudster side, but also on the technology side. I mean, it's always been the same. I mean, yeah, in terms of law enforcement, look, I honestly don't think it's so much an expertise issue. It's a resource issue. If you look in most countries of modern day law enforcement, take the current coronavirus, where a lot of law enforcement activity is being focused on public safety, having to enforce COVID type restrictions. That's not easy. And you need to say, okay, well, where do those resources come from? Because they've only got limited resources. So for me, law enforcement response to what we could say cyber fraud, cyber attacks, I think it's there, but whether it's resourced enough, in most cases, I think not.
Yeah, interesting. Do you think we're going to start to see a rebalance where we're more successful in terms of, combating these various threat actors and the resulting frauds? I don't know who would like to take that. Maybe I can push that to Philippe in first place.
Or can you repeat?
Yeah, do you think we're going to start to see a rebalancing where, we, by working together with law enforcement and the regulators, we're going to start to see a, more effective combating of the various threats? You're shaking your head disappointingly.
Yes and no. Yes, because law enforcement have a broader view and can educate the market. They can pass on information of what's happening. And banks need this information to combat more effectively fraud. So they need information, and these authorities can give information. And no, because that's not the role of the authorities. They sit in a very comfortable seat where they can judge what the banks have done, and if something goes wrong, they can then investigate and blame. This is a very comfortable seat where I used to sit. But there is no public role or public missions to help combat the crimes really. And if you see the composition of the supervisory authority in your different countries, there are very little people taking care of fraud. At least in Switzerland, I would not know one, to be honest. And this is probably something to change. And the circulation between supervisory authority, law enforcement authority, private sector is probably more established in UK than in the rest of Europe.
Yeah, that's interesting. And, I guess, so as RUSI, so Royal United Services Institute, put a paper out probably in the last couple of months or so, and they sort of spoke about the fraud threat to the UK being a national security level threat, and they spoke about and they wrote about there being a responsibility vacuum, I guess specifically relating to kind of information sharing, public-private partnerships, and the use of effective data analytics to combat the threat. So yeah, it's interesting times certainly. And in terms of that threat, Ronan, is there anything that you're doing within your organization to change, to adapt to the shift in the threat patterns, to adapt to the escalation in the fraud threat?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Information sharing is a good point. Definitely, our information sharing has increased. We're nearly on weekly calls at this stage in terms of ensuring that identified trends and even to the level of persons and so on are identified. And certainly, we've a very good relationship with law enforcement here in Ireland. One thing on that that I would criticise is the European Commission. I don't see anything coming out of the Commission. I see a lot about money laundering. I don't see anything about fraud coming from the Commission. And actually, EU citizens are victims of this. And what we see increasingly is cross-jurisdictional stuff. All of it's cross-jurisdictional. So you have your customer, your victim in Ireland, and you have the mule is in Germany, and the organisers in France, and the three countries are absolutely bogged down in paperwork to try and sort that out. I mean, even to take a case on that, it becomes difficult because of the requirement to bring the victim to a certain jurisdiction. So that something has to give there, because people will. Customers rightly and citizens rightly will start to say, hold on a second, we have to, we have a common market, but we don't have any common way of dealing with fraud in the market. So I think there's definitely an issue there. But in terms of what you can do at a practical level on your systems, I think every organization's systems are good. But I mean, obviously you can always learn, but in terms of increasing their effectiveness, we really need to increase the effectiveness of customers to be able to stop themselves, because a lot of the stuff that goes on in the fraud event is not something that the bank could ever control. It's simply out. It's just activity that we can't get into. I mean, what I could say is, what organizations might want to consider is seeing where their brand is being mentioned on the web. Where is your company being mentioned? Where are your IBANs available? Are you looking for your IBANs proactively? Do you have a search functionality to say, okay, let's have a look at how many of our bank IBANs are out there at the moment? Why are they out there? And that kind of research can be very valuable in terms of stopping something before it starts. You can see then something's being created or being prepared for an onward attack. So on a practical level, I'd certainly advise increasing research like that.
Interesting. And I guess maybe pushing that to Romano, is that something, I presume you talk with your counterparts and colleagues in other organizations. Is that something that you're seeing would bring value and benefit?
Yes, definitely. So I think, as Ronan already stated, the first thing is that we have to change this information. So we have to speak together. We have to share all these fraud cases that we have in order that we can learn from each other, and not only within Switzerland, but we have also to go cross-border. We have to share this information. I think what also helped us is really a good collaboration with other banks. So when we saw that the payment goes from our bank to an Irish bank, that we can call them and say, please stop the payment. That's one thing that we are really focused on, and we try to enforce also. But we have what we saw as before, also the Philippe mentioned, is from a criminal persecution side. So all our requests for legal assistance remain so we make a request for legal assistance, but with this nothing happens. So we are really lost in this. We know who the criminals are. We have really a lot of information about them, but nobody helps us. And this is really a big point that is we are facing now. We try to combat this, but it's really difficult. And maybe what also I want to add something. When we try to help our customer or to avoid that our customer loses money, we saw in the past year we had rules with our filters that were good for the past. But now, as I told you, all frauds that happens are no longer technical anomalies, but there are really anomalies in the payment behavior of the customer. And so we are no longer able to detect them with our static rules that we have. And what we need is artificial intelligence, because we have a lot of data and only artificial intelligence can help us to read this data and also interpret what is the content of this data in order to prevent fraud. And I think this is one thing that goes really in the right direction, the use of AI in order to detect fraud.
Okay.
And if I can continue on what you said, Romano, I think one of the approach that some banks are considering is to put together or put closer together different lines of defense of the bank. The ones taking care of financial crime, the one taking care of fraud, the one taking care of cybersecurity. Normally, they go different road within the bank and they don't speak together. And one of the means may be to make them more closer together. Fin crime, cyber crime, and fraud, because they have similar tools, and by defining different scenarios, you can probably help each other better to tackle fraud.
Interesting. Yeah, a very interesting, very insightful comment. Steve, anything to add there?
Yeah, just build on what Romano and Philippe said, and also Ronan. Philippe makes a good point. Breaking down silos that grow up within banks is absolutely essential. And let's be fair, Ronan's point about payments profiles, really well made. We've really just got to stop it going out the door. I wouldn't be too hard on the EU or any government about levels of cooperation, because if we look, where does big money really go? So if you're faced with a big funds transfer that goes into China, I mean, try cooperating with the Chinese bank, the Chinese authorities on recovery. I mean, quite frankly, I know there's quite a big audience listening, but for me, it hasn't been a great experience. There's many countries that have weak infrastructures and poor judicial systems, which are bogged down with unbelievable bureaucracy and process, that we just have to stop it going out the door. That's our only chance, really.
Mm.
Yeah, just to pick up on that point, Steve. I mean, as soon as you're picking up the phone to the police, it's over.
Yeah,
it's done.
Yeah.
Ronan, I'm
lucky, but
Yeah, but Ronan, I'm cautious because I used to do that, and you are literally talking about so many competing priorities, and there is a sort of a view that the banks are big enough and well resourced enough to potentially be able to look after themselves, which is why it's why these technologies, and Philippe speaking more to a strategic approach, are so absolutely vital.
Yeah, because as you know, I mean, the reality is recovery in those situations is nigh impossible, and what you really want to do is make sure if it does happen, at least it doesn't happen such a huge amount, huge size, or it's minimized as much as possible. But at least that if you're at that stage, you're going to be in difficulty, obviously.
Yeah. And so I guess kind of, pulling together some of those thoughts. So talking a little bit about the convergence of, fin crime, cyber, anti-fraud, etc. Talking about the responsibility of the banks as, as perhaps the last line of defense there. Is that fair? Is it fair to you to take that responsibility for, being that last line of defense, educating the customers, paying to educate those customers? Are you seeing different demands for staffing your teams? Are you finding these people that have these wonderful combinations of skills? Perhaps I can throw that to Steve in first place.
Yeah, to be honest, Roy, look, these things are so complicated. Inevitably, it takes a combination of skill sets working together to come up with these solutions. Listen, when I was brought up, we didn't even have the internet. You talk about infection, being infected with COVID. People say, be careful, your machine isn't infected by malware. I'm still trying to understand exactly all these different malware components. But apparently, they're as dangerous as COVID when they're in the cyberspace. So, yeah, the level of skill that is required in this technical area, I just think it's enormous.
Any comments there, Romano? Are you finding it easy to find the right sort of skill sets?
It's not that easy, but I think also it depends a little bit from what we are talking. So we have the one that are responsible in order to handle all these fraud hits that we generate. So, and there I can say the only thing that we need is we need a good tool in order that they can do their job. But on the other hand side, I think we have a really lack of cybersecurity people, and these are really, really hard to find. And from my point of view, we should hire really people from the darknet, because they really know what happens there. And sometimes you hire cybersecurity people, they have a good CV and all the things, but they really don't know what happens in the underground. And from my point of view, this is one of the biggest challenges, one of the biggest problem, that we need really good people that know what happens around us, and they are capable to respond to these threats.
Interesting. And Philippe, I guess maybe if you could comment on terms of sort of your advisory and forensic work, is that kind of a theme that you're seeing echoed when you go and talk with executives in financial services institutions?
Not really about the people tackling fraud within the banks. Fraud is still an unwanted word in at least the Swiss banking world. So you never speak about fraud within and outside the organization. It starts to change, but this is taboo. I agree with Steve that this is never-ending run. Fraud will never stop, and I have to say that banks are taking that very seriously to what external fraud are concerned, and they put in place systems and people and intelligent automation and so forth. So they're up to speed here. Where I see a lack is still in the internal fraud. And if you see the headlines of the newspaper, the biggest fraud cases are always internal fraud cases. That's where they have the most damages, and you lose the most money, and above all, the most reputation. And here I see banks still struggling with that, putting in place mechanisms that will draw the internal suspicions, but as well controls over their C-level and managers, and maybe some kind of HR related controls. We're still working on trust, which is very good, but trust is probably not enough. And I'm still amazed about how many people knew about a fraud case when it happened, internal people. So I think this is one of the biggest challenges. I know this is complicated. I know this is a kind of revolution, internal revolution. But if you look to the industry outside of the banking sector, they went to this path, and the banking world should a little bit look to what happened in food industry, for instance, or in watchmaking industry, for instance, or in luxury. Good, but there are examples to take there.
Interesting. I'm conscious of time, and I want to allow a little bit of time for some questions. And the questions, I've just looked at my question panel, and there's lots, and some that have been fed through to me. And perhaps we could go to, we've got 10 minutes left, just under 10 minutes left. Perhaps we could pick up some of these questions. I'm conscious of time, and also the logistics of me unmuting people. Perhaps this first one I will just try and voice. So this is a question from Katarzyna Jedlinska. So in the context of internal fraud, so just building on what we were talking about there, Philippe, so combating fraud by employees when it's easier when they're working from home. So two-part question. Are you aware of any cases where this risk has materialized? Firstly, and secondly, is there any practical advice you can offer with regards to any additional controls that could be relevant specifically in the employee screening process? And we covered this a little bit earlier, perhaps. I don't know who anyone would like to jump in on either of those questions. No?
So I can go. I haven't seen fraud from people working from home yet.
Okay.
I was reported no case on that. Maybe it will come. And the most effective way to combat fraud in this context is the knowledge of the people working with this fraudster internally. Mm-hmm. They have seen something, they have heard something, they have suspicion, and the main challenge of the bank is how do you get to this voice? How do you get this message? And some kinds of whistleblowing or hotline or ethic lines or whatever and compliance culture is a good answer. The answer is not a hard factor, but it's probably to be found in the soft factors.
Okay, interesting. Anyone got anything to add to that?
Yeah, right, Steve, I'd echo what Philippe says. I know, speaking to colleagues, the issue of working from home, we haven't seen any real rises in fraud.
Okay, good. Well, that's good to hear anyway. So I'm just picking these off in order. It's hard to listen to your responses as well as read them. So third-party supplier risk, any comments, experiences, thoughts?
Maybe I can just say we had third-party suppliers that were compromised, and so far it was not a really high risk for us, but it shows that this is something that is really increasing, and we need to take a look at this because it could be that we receive maybe some software update from one of our supplier that is infected, and that could be a really high damage for our bank. But so far we have cases, but we need to monitor them closely.
Okay, thank you. I'm just trying to pick, and really conscious of the time, pick some questions here. So the question here about fraud prevention and management techniques, and we covered this a little bit earlier. Is there any other insights about tools and techniques that any of the panelists can offer in terms of, specific steps that they've put in place to combat changing threats or emerging threats recently?
Just on that, Roy, I would say again, make sure whoever conducts your risk assessments, make sure they are factoring in fraud if you're not doing standalone fraud risk assessments. It's very important to go to frontline business owners and areas, and don't, really important to talk to people who actually are doing the things every day and ask them, what are you currently doing? What are you doing extra? And if they say, well, we don't do anything extra, at least you can say, well, you might have a gap here. And that's really important. It has to be done. And they might not like what you're telling them, but it's really important you ask the questions. At least it goes into their head and they start to think about it. That's really important.
Yeah, okay. Anyone got anything to add to that while I go and try and find another question?
Yeah, Roy, I would say it's worth attendees considering some sort of recognition scheme. If you've had a staff member prevent a fraud, I would say make a big deal out of it, and with some form of recognition scheme. And if you can, publicize it, because the more you can keep that message alive in a positive way, you'll get good results.
That's a great idea. Great idea. This one's getting quite detailed, so maybe I can push this one to Romano in first instance. Is there any possibility to block spoof calls in your region or your organization, specifically against card and digital banking portfolio products? This is coming from a fraud officer. We've tried with telcos, but we have been unable to do this as been a challenge in social engineering fraud for us.
Exactly. I can just confirm this. It's really a challenge to block them. We try to do this in blocking numbers or something like this, but it's really difficult. And from my point of view, it's at the moment it's really hard to block them. But we also have no tools or some suggestions that we can give on it. We are struggling with the same problem from which we don't have a solution yet.
Right. Okay, thank you. Following on, another technique question here. So what is the most used, hang on, this doesn't make sense. What is the most used artificial intelligence to combat fraud? How should an AI-based anti-fraud system, and what should it look like? Let me paraphrase that a bit. So I guess, in terms of what you do to combat that risk, is there any advice? Is there any specific experiences that you've had that you could perhaps pass on that's been useful, positive, etc.? I don't know anyone want to jump in on that?
I think what you need now is a tool to precisely combat fraud. It didn't exist 2-3 years ago, and it's become not mandatory, but very, very advised. And all the panelists that we are speaking with have this kind of system, and this is a must now. It is still to be developed in order to reduce the noise, if possible, and that's the next challenge.
Okay, thank you. And perhaps we maybe pick another last couple of questions. So talking a little bit about social engineering and investments scams that we were discussing earlier. So when it comes to those sorts of scams and associated social engineering, is it fair that the customer should ultimately bear liability at least for a portion of the money that they lose to the fraudster? Anyone got any views on that?
I'll immediately jump in, Roy, because all of your attendees should read Philippe v. Barclays, the big case in the High Court, in the English High Court, where the English High Court said, sorry, Barclays don't owe you any money because you've been the victim of an authorized push payment fraud, i.e. a scam. It's not quite the same as an investment scam, but I would advise everyone to read that case. It's very important because it really finally does lay down some real, certainly under English law, it lays down some real clear red lines about where the bank's responsibility starts and where it ends. And it was a very helpful case because a lot of people were still very unclear about that. But there's no doubt the bank will continue to be, we are the safe guardians, and have a look at what your safeguarding procedures are in terms of your customers, because as Steve pointed out earlier, a lot of these people are a bit naive, and what are you doing to educate them? Because that's really the key, is to have that chat, if you can have the chat. And that's the problem in the remote environment. We're losing that conversation that we used to have with the customer, where we could say, have you thought about it? Are you sure you want to do it? You know what this is about? Because that's the step that will safeguard a customer. But ultimately, that decision seems to lay down again that, unfortunately, buyer beware when you're moving money like that.
Okay, and another question's just literally popped in while you were answering that one, and I guess it's quite related to it. So it's kind of also looking at this idea of responsibility and liability here, but kind of flipping it. So the question here is relating, are they coming in still? This is relating to mule accounts. So what are our panelists' views on bank accounts opened fraudulently, specifically mule accounts that are then used to commit fraud, specifically with insurers or asset managers, who in this instance should hold responsibility for these fraudulent activities? Philippe, smiling, nodding somewhat. Would we care to respond to that one?
At the end, I can tell you the answer of all customers. They would say the bank should have seen something.
Surprise.
So I'll attack the bank. So the question who bears the responsibility is the theoretical one. In 100% of the cases, the client will try to attack the bank. So you better try to avoid these problems and prevent them.
Okay. And we're out of time. Let me pick one last question. I've got 3 or 4 coming in here. Sorry, it's hard to read. No, I think we've kind of talked about that. as AI is more and more requested to detect customer abnormal behavior, how do you deal with access to data for data scientists and analysts? Getting very deep in the weeds here. Anyone got a view on that? Ronan? No?
I'm not techie enough.
Okay, all right, thank you. So I guess on the basis that we're already over time, perhaps we should call it a day and draw a line under those questions. And there are additional questions. What perhaps we will try and do is to respond to the submitters of those questions once the panel's over. So thank you very much to all of my panelists for joining today. It was really interesting for me personally. Hopefully all of our attendees found it likewise. So thank you to Ronan, Romano, Steve, and Philippe. I hope, hopefully, that the attendees have found something of use that they can take back, that they've gleaned some insight, or at least picked up some advice that they can take back into their businesses and their everyday roles. So keep an eye out. We will be running more of these sessions in the future. So we're planning to increase our sort of frequency of these. We're also involved in other things. So we're also involved in pushing fraud intelligence service through to our subscribers. So it will be interesting for subscribers to our service to keep an eye out for that stuff as well. So thank you very much to panelists. We seem to have lost Steve, or at least I can't see him anymore. So maybe he had something to go to. So thank you very much. It really was very much appreciated for your attendance, your insight, and your expertise. So thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks
Thank
again.
you,
very
guys.
much.
Have a nice day. Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you soon.